It's member-supported Hawaii Public Radio, all things considered, and I'm Dave Lawrence. We are thrilled because we've got a very special return engagement in Honolulu happening on the Blue Note. He played last night, and he's playing again tonight. It's Pat Metheny. He's back for what I believe is his first show here in 33 years. Does that sound accurate, Pat?
That sounds exactly accurate. I've been kind of... I keep very elaborate notes and have for... well, going way before that, since the late 70s. So I can kind of keep track of things. And I used to come here pretty often, you know. I mean, we used to play like at the Blaisdell, and we played, you know, at the Waikiki Shell several times. And then there was a weird other kind of club at one point that I can't remember what it was. But yeah, it's just been a long time since I've played here. I've actually been here a bunch of times because, like everybody else, I love coming to Hawaii and brought, you know, my kids and family here several times actually. And so I was very happy to get invited here. It's great to be back.
It's wonderful to have you back. And thanks to Steve, the mystery emailer who sent me the information. It was October 1985. You guys were doing the Waikiki show, as you mentioned. That was the last of the gigs. So you're back with an entirely different cast of characters. For folks who are curious about coming out and seeing the show, a lot of classic Metheny material in there. And if you are a fan of the group or fan of some of his other work, you'd be surprised how much he can sort of roll familiar tunes into the set. Tell the folks who you've got in the band with you this time and why you've selected these particular musicians.
Well, you know, it's true. I mean, it's kind of odd in a way that the 33 years or whatever it is between then and now. I mean, I've done, God, I don't know how many records and written probably a couple hundred tunes. And each one of those projects had its own tour and, you know, own lineup and everything very specific to what that music was. But of course, none of it ever came here to Hawaii. So in a way, it's kind of a moot point. But, one thing I had never done is just kind of go through the book a little bit. I mean, usually it's all about the new music, and I had kind of set aside a block of time, and you know, thought, well, I'm just going to find some really good musicians who can play across the spectrum of my thing, which now is not that hard to do because, I mean, the way things work, and it was the same for me when I learned Gary Burton's music and Herbie's music and everybody else's music. I was growing up learning that stuff, and now there's actually not just one, two generations of musicians who've kind of grown up with my stuff, who are very fluent in that language. And Linda O, who is playing bass, I mean, you know, she grew up listening to the record Question and Answer and knows those tunes inside out, backwards and forwards, and knows that whole concept, and also is familiar with all my other stuff. And then Gwilym Simcock, who's playing piano, you know, his first record was Travels. Him and Brad Meldau, they're both the same. It's like that record was the first thing when they were 10 or 11 years old that got them kind of going into a zone like that. And then, you know, for actually this whole period of time, except for this gig, my main partner over these years, Antonio Sanchez, has been playing drums, but this kind of got added at the end, and he had something he could not get out of. So Scott Amendola, who's a great West Coast drummer, is coming and filling in, and Scott also is kind of in that category of guys who are, you know, 15, 20 years younger than me that grew up, you know, listening to Bright Size Life and, you know, all those records, and they know that stuff. And it's so interesting in a way because at the time when I was coming up, I mean, trying to find people who kind of understood what my general concept was about, you know, orchestration and dynamics, and not to mention the specifics of rhythm section playing that I had a very particular idea about. I mean, you know, I could count them on one hand on every instrument. And I mean, probably within 10 miles of here, I could put together 6 bands now, It's just, it's just part of the vocabulary now. And so it's really fun to get back in that zone and also to hear what those guys have to contribute to what that music can be. And it's always surprising for me. And, I'm kind of leaning on the tunes that are sort of the most robust to get pounded on each night. And they tend to be the kinds of tunes that have a simpler kind of form. I mean, there's a whole subcategory of tunes of mine that are like 36 pages long, and you got to rehearse for 2 weeks to get through the tune. I'm staying away from those. This is more the tunes that you can just kind of play them.
You had a great talking about how these cats have grown up listening to your tunes, kind of shaped by them through their own lives, and then seeing how they might add or kind of accentuate the work. It makes me think you're a dude who, when it comes to early childhood development, when me and you were younger, it wasn't as thought of as it is now. There's this whole understanding of if you get a kid around something when they're really young, it can really have a blossoming effect years later. And when you were talking about your band members, and I couldn't help but think of your own childhood. You're a guy who was surrounded by music by your family, and also the trumpet playing a really important role. And all of a sudden, at some point in your life, by exposure to different things on TV, I guess it was, with certain influences, others with maybe the brother bringing home a record. Explain, when you look back at yourself, how this really shaped you as a person, because here you are all these years later, and you've made such a comfortable living doing that same thing, working with music.
Well, for me, I'm chronologically kind of right at that place where, I was born in 1954. So when I was like 8, 9, 10, that's sort of when the Beatles and all this kind of stuff emerged, where the guitar became more than just an instrument. It was sort of the iconic, marker of something that was about to happen, and it did, and somehow the guitar has a place in that story that's really singular. And I responded to that as a sort of pre-adolescent, whatever, just the idea of a guitar. Where my story was a little odd, and I note this more and more as the years go by, and I look back on it, because of this trumpet thing in my family that you're talking about. My brother Mike brought home a Miles record very shortly after I had kind of been attracted to the guitar, had finally convinced my parents not to buy me a guitar, but my Christmas present one year was permission to earn my own money to buy a guitar. That was the present, which I did. And, for a few weeks after I got that guitar, I was, kind of interested in rock and roll or whatever. But Mike brought home this Miles record, and it was literally like somebody flipping a switch for me. The record was Four and More. When I heard that record, that was just it for me. And I was 11. And, I do hear this thing, you hear people say about jazz. So it's like, you got to develop a taste for it, and you got to learn. Maybe for some people, but for me, it was like somebody hit me over the head with a baseball bat in about 1 second. That was it. It's like, man, whatever that is, I want to know what that is. And it's the same for me right now. It has not changed. I want to know what that is. And the natural response for me when I want to learn about music is to understand how it works. So that's been a process for me since then. But if I look at really what made the difference for me, certainly, yes, my family was musical and all that. But the main thing was I happened to be born 30 some miles away from Kansas City at a period where there was a very active local scene in Kansas City with incredible musicians and just weirdly no guitar players, or very few. So I ended up being able to start working when I was about 14. So by the time I was 17 and left Kansas City, I had worked hundreds of gigs with great musicians. To this day, some of the best musicians I've ever been around. And that was the thing for me. And that's still the thing, is that being around people who are better than you are is the place to be. And, sometimes people come up and my advice is always the same: try to be the worst guy in every band you're in, because if you're around good musicians, that makes you better. And I mean, for age 14, 15, 16, 17, it was all organ trio kind of stuff, and with guys who could really, really play. And that was a huge thing for me, and remains a huge thing for me.
Very few musicians, though, could... I mean, with all the prep that you had, and I can imagine, you described it well. You filled a real hole. There was nobody to play the guitar, so you were able to do a lot of gigs in that moment. When Bill Lee shows up in Kansas, I mean, this is like, and I know you've told the story many times, but for people who are aspiring, who are trying to develop anything in their life, try to explain how you go from being asked to come to a school on a scholarship, and within a week, you're being asked, you could teach. You could actually go from, hey, we'd love to have you come. We're going to give you a scholarship. We'll basically pay for your education to come. And within a week, they've made the move. No, you could actually be a teacher here.
It's one of those kind of weird things. It's true. I mean, well, and again, you kind of have to look at it in the context of that time, which was very different than now. So being my age, I graduated from high school in 1972. It was a mercy graduation, because the story that I just described, from the point that I heard Miles till the time I got out of high school, I never took a book home. And I managed to fake my way somehow through all of this, except for two classes that you cannot fake, which are typing and Spanish. Those I had to actually somehow get a, D minus, or, like just enough to pass. But the thing is, I mean, now I have 3 kids. So I understand a lot of stuff now that I didn't understand at all at the time about my parents. And for sure, the happiest day of their entire lives was the day that you mentioned that Dr. Bill Lee, who was the dean of the music school at the University of Miami, came to Kansas City specifically to recruit me to go to the University of Miami, because, and this is the thing, at that point in time, there were only 2 places in the United States that were universities, accredited universities, where you could study electric guitar. One was North Texas State, now they call it North Texas, I think, or University of North Texas. And the other was somewhere in Utah. Wow. And, there was Berkeley, but that was more like a vocational school. But electric guitar was not recognized as an actual instrument. The University of Miami decided that they were going to do it. They were going to make the leap. And so Dr. Lee had heard about me from, I don't know, the grapevine or whatever, about the Midwest, and came. And so when I went home and told my mom and dad, hey, there's a guy, he's offered me a full scholarship. I mean, they were like crying with joy, because they, as far as they were concerned, me deciding I'm going to be a jazz musician playing the guitar is exactly the equivalent if one of my kids came home and said, Dad, I've decided I'm going to become a professional Minecraft player. It's like, no, you're not. I would be like, that's insane. That's what it was for them, So, the fact that this guy came was great. So I go down to the University of Miami, and they have announced they are opening up the guitar program there. They were expecting 4 or 5 students. They had 80 electric guitar students that had just showed up. They freaked because they had 1 teacher, and they needed another teacher. And so part 2 of this is that, so I enroll at the University of Miami, and I go to English 101 because the University of Miami is an actual university. I mean, I was very close to illiterate. I didn't know any. I mean, yeah, I had just faked from 6th grade to 12th grade. So I'm like, there is no way I'm going to be able to hang with this. That night, after that English class, I met Jaco Pastorius, who became my best buddy. We ended up playing all night, and he had a gig, and he said, hey man, you got to make this gig. So within 2 days I was working in Miami and skipping classes already. So I went to Dr. Lee after a week, and I was like, this is great that you did this and all that, but I can't do this, man. And he said, well, we were meaning to talk to you anyway. And then they hired me to teach. So I taught there for a year. And during that year is when I met Gary Burton at a festival back in the Midwest. And then he offered me a gig to teach at Berkeley with kind of the caveat, like, maybe I'm going to hire you, which was my dream gig. That was like joining the Beatles for me. And if I had done nothing in my entire life except play Walter L. with Gary Burton one time, that would have been more than my wildest dream. And I got to do that. And then he thought I was a candidate for his band. And and I ended up very shortly after that joining his band when I just turned 19.
Paul's Mall, the Jazz Workshop, what a scene was. I went to Emerson, so I have a familiarity with it, and I lived there for 12 years. It was happening back then when you got...
And Emerson was the cool jazz station in town, too.
Yeah, WERS. Exactly. That was my first station.
Was it really? Yeah.
That's right. I learned all my stuff. So, yeah, it was really... Fred Taylor was running the... now.
2 weeks ago, we did a gig for Fred Taylor.
Scullers.
No, he promotes concerts. Scullers, he no longer works there, actually.
Oh, okay. Wow. So he's doing...
I mean, he's 93, I think.
Legendary dude who was such a sweetie pie. I always enjoyed...
Yeah.
Always enjoyed being around him. Well, as we go to wrap it up with you, 'cause you've been generous with your time, and you kind of explained one of the many questions I have, because I've been a fan of yours since going to the Tower Records on South Street in the fall of '87. I was down in the basement in the jazz section, and I walked up to the guy at the counter. I said, what is this that's playing? And he pointed to Still Life Talking, which was sitting on the counter. And I said, may I get a copy of that? And it took me from the world of metal and hard rock and to so many other things. And one of the sounds about your guitar throughout different points of your life, and one of the things you've achieved a lot of notoriety for is these unbelievable tones that Pat has, and it's been achieved through guitar synthesizers, it's been achieved through other techniques. When did you first start? Because I guess it's a Roland that you break out on the stage to use those tones. When did you first start doing that? And if you can shed a little light onto one of the aspects of your work, which is so special, which is your very unique tones and sounds that you make.
Well, it's funny because for me, I mean, at the core, everything is coming really from the three main people for me, who are Kenny Burrell, Jim Hall, and then especially Wes Montgomery, because Wes for me was and is it. That's the model. And in that sense, kind of the fundamental thing for me was I wanted to do what Wes did, but I wanted to do what he did, not what he did. And when I first started, I played with my thumb, and I did like what most young people do. It's like, I really tried to sound like Wes. And I realized that it's like I loved him so much that that actually was really not what I wanted to do. I wanted to do, something where at the same way he reflected what he loved, that I could do that too. That was the ideal for me. At that point, I thought, okay, so within this realm, I mean, I don't even like the word jazz that much. I mean, whatever this form is that this community of musicians lives within, which is this sort of, it's almost like an Uber form, because I mean, it's like, the people of our thing, it's like we can play written music, we can play free, we can play loud, we can play soft, we can play fast, we can play slow. It's not about a style of music, it's about a way of being a musician. And I thought, well, this instrument is so undefined. I mean, it's like you say the word guitar to 5 people and you can see each one of them gets a different thought bubble over their head, right? It could be Wes Montgomery, it could be Segovia, it could be death metal, it could be, I mean, the word guitar just is anything, really. And yet within our community at that time in the, early 70s, it was a thing. It was a, hollow body guy usually and an amp, and that was it. And so at a pretty early stage, I thought, okay, well, I want to expand out of that. And some of that was sound. To me, it's like when I heard tenor players, it seemed like it was coming from everywhere, and especially drums. It wasn't like coming from a box over there. And so very early on, I was messing around with putting speakers all over the place and all that. And, trying to get this sense that the sound was not coming from a singular place. And that may have been the first effort in that department. And then it was sort of like, okay, when I'm hearing music in my head, I'm thinking more in terms of orchestration. So why am I limiting it to just this? I mean, it could be, one of the things guitar does best is strumming, like, sitting around the campfire. Like, why doesn't anybody do that, And then it was, during almost my entire time as a musician, this amazing sort of like golden era of musical technology expansion. Just all these things were happening, all these new possibilities and devices and new ways of doing things. So, a lot of people, again, within this community resisted that. I was like, man, I'm not going to resist that at all. What reeds are to saxophone players, wires and knobs are to me. So, I've been very comfortable living inside all of that. And at the same time, people say that they usually can tell it's me, whether it's acoustic guitar or the synth or the electric or whatever, because and also if you were to hear me play piano, I think you would hear me doing it too, because to me the ideas are before the sound. And so I'm always thinking about ideas, and then I'm thinking of how to orchestrate that idea. And certain ideas are better expressed within this type of orchestration or that type of orchestration or this type of a dynamic range or that type of a dynamic range. But I'm thinking sort of from the pre-sound part, and then the sound is the sort of the translation device of the idea. And it kind of works like that for me. And that sound can show up in a lot of different ways. And specific to your question, this particular sound, which is a kind of very identifiable to me one, because I think everybody else stays away from it now. But it is this wacky technology that emerged in 1978. Even the people at Roland, the company that made it, don't exactly know what it is or how it works, because they bought it from some guy on Hokkaido Island who brought it down to Roland and sold it to them. They have never been able to reverse engineer what it is. And they actually discontinued it after a year. So there's not even that many of them around. I have to kind of hoard them, especially the cable. It's got this weird cable. So whenever I see one, on eBay or whatever, I buy it. But it's a very particular sound. This is like, almost 10 years before MIDI existed. It is not a synth. It's not anything that you can sort of describe in analog synth type terms, let alone digital synth type terms. It's just this weird particular tech that does this one thing really well. And and also what you hear when I'm playing it is very little of it. It's more like it's like a reverb triggering device.
And some delay that you get on.
Yeah, I mean, it's like if you heard just the raw thing, you'd almost not even recognize it. It's sort of like I have twisted it into that thing that it is now known as being, but it doesn't really exist like that. So.
Well, that's a great way to wrap it up, because that's a lot about what you do with music. You make things that don't really exist. That's why so many people just love you. You're my very favorite guitar player, and it's a huge thrill that you would take some time for us. The great Pat Metheny, the one and only. He's got one more night with a pair of shows coming up tonight, and we're really grateful that you would take some time for us, and hopefully this kept you somewhat interested.
Oh, it's been great. Thank you. I really appreciate it, and so happy to be back here in Hawaii to play for everybody.
Well, grateful to have you. Thanks, Pat.
Cool. Thank you. Aloha, everybody. It's Pat Metheny. I don't care what else is going on. I don't miss this show. Even if I'm on the other side of the world, in the middle of a gig, I could be sleeping. It doesn't matter. It all comes to a screeching halt when this show starts. It's All Things Considered on member-supported Hawaii Public Radio. We're with my friend Dave Lawrence, but please do me a solid and make an investment in our community with a pledge right now. We're grateful for whatever you can afford, and thanks for giving HPR a helping hand.